Greetings to you all. Whether you come with faith curiosity or scholarly interest, I invite you to walk with me through the rich and fascinating history of Israel's God, from El, the high god of Canaan, to Yahweh, the one who became Lord of all. In the beginning, there was a God who preceded Yahweh. His name was El, the father of gods and the creator of worlds. In the Canaanite tradition, El was supreme, enthroned upon a mountain, presiding over a council of divine beings. Among those who gathered in his court were Baal, Asherah, and Yahweh himself. El was not a metaphor, nor merely a pagan echo, but the great high god of the Levantine world, the very context in which Israel first took shape. The traces of El endure even in the language of the Bible. The very name Israel means El rules or El persists. The place name Bethel means house of El. In early biblical usage, we encounter El in titles such as El Elyon, God Most High, and El Shaddai, God Almighty. Genesis 17:1 records El Shaddai appearing to Abraham. Genesis 49:25 blesses Jacob's descendants by El Shaddai with fertility and protection. These were roles long associated with El, not with Yahweh. Yet as time passed, El began to fade from view. He was not erased outright, but absorbed as Yahweh gradually inherited his names, titles, and identity. Much of what we know about El also comes from ancient Ugaritic texts. Ugaritic was the language of the city of Ugarit in modern-day Syria, written in a cuneiform alphabet around 1200 BCE. Discovered in the 20th century at Ras Shamra, these clay tablets preserve myths, hymns, and epics of the Canaanite pantheon. They describe El as the wise and eternal king, Baal as the storm god who rides the clouds, and Asherah as the mother of the gods. These are the very same figures who reappear in the Bible, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes opposed, sometimes transformed. In these earliest biblical layers, Yahweh was not the only God, nor the sole creator. Deuteronomy 32:8, in its ancient form preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, manuscripts from Qumran, dating from the 3rd century BCE onwards, and the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible produced in the 2nd century BCE, describes how the Most High, El Elyon, divided the nations among the sons of God. In that division, Yahweh was assigned Israel. Only later, in the standard Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, was this changed to read Sons of Israel, obscuring the older memory of a divine assembly. The origins of Yahweh lie not in Jerusalem, but in the deserts to the south. Deuteronomy 33:2 and Judges 5:4 describe him as coming from Seir and shining forth from Mount Paran. These are regions on the southern edges of Judah. Egyptian records from the 13th century BCE speak of the Shasu of Yahweh, nomadic tribes who worshipped a deity named Yahweh in precisely these desert territories. The Shasu were wandering pastoralists, and their Yahweh was most likely a storm or warrior god of thunder and wilderness. At first, then, Yahweh was a local deity, one among many. Over time, Yahweh was adopted into Israel's religious life and gradually elevated. Exodus 6:3 even acknowledges this process. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh I was not known to them. The patriarchs, according to this testimony, worshipped El, not Yahweh. But as scribes retold and re-edited traditions, El's identity and Yahweh's identity were woven together until the distinction vanished. Titles such as El Elyon and El Shaddai were retained, but they were now claimed by Yahweh. This transformation did not occur in isolation. Yahweh's profile grew at the expense of other deities, above all Baal. Baal was widely worshipped in Canaan and Syria as the storm god, the cloud rider, the bringer of rain and fertility, and the warrior who defeated the chaotic sea called Yam. Israelite poets borrowed Baal's imagery but applied it to Yahweh. Psalm 29, for example, echoes Ugaritic hymns to Baal almost line for line, but Yahweh, is named in his place. The famous story in 1 Kings 18 illustrates this rivalry. On Mount Carmel, Elijah challenged Baal's prophets. Baal remained silent, while Yahweh answered with fire from heaven. The narrative is not only about a miracle, it is theological polemic, showing Baal as powerless and Yahweh as supreme. In effect, Yahweh took Baal's crown while denouncing his name. But Baal was not the only rival. Archaeological discoveries have shown that Yahweh was once worshipped with a partner. At the desert site of Kuntilat Ajrud, inscriptions from the 8th century BCE invoke Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. Asherah was the ancient Canaanite mother goddess, long regarded as the consort of El. If Yahweh had merged with El, then Asherah might naturally have followed. These inscriptions suggest that, in popular practice, Yahweh was not alone, but honored with a female counterpart. Yet later reformers condemned her worship as idolatry. The decisive break came under King Josiah in the 7th century BCE. According to 2 Kings 22-23, a book of the law was discovered in the temple, most likely an early form of Deuteronomy. Josiah responded with sweeping reforms. He destroyed rural shrines, cut down Asherah poles, burned altars, and centralized all worship in Jerusalem. What had once been tolerated, local shrines, diverse practices, multiple divine figures, was now outlawed. Josiah's reform was not only religious, but political, consolidating power around one temple, one text, and one God. The Babylonian conquest of 586 BCE marked the next turning point. Jerusalem fell, the temple was destroyed, and the people were exiled. For many nations, such disaster meant the defeat of their God. But in exile, Israel's scribes gave a different explanation. Yahweh had not failed. He had deliberately allowed Babylon to conquer as punishment for Israel's sins. He was no longer a national God limited to one land, but a universal judge who ruled over all nations. In exile, without a temple, Yahweh's reach became limitless. It was in this period that earlier traditions were edited and reshaped. The divine council faded from view, El was absorbed, Asherah was silenced. Yahweh alone remained. 2nd Isaiah proclaims, "I am Yahweh, and there is no other." Isaiah 45:5. A once local deity had become the sole God of heaven and earth. Even passages that hinted at plurality, such as Genesis chapter 1:26, "Let us make man in our image," were read in new ways to reinforce Yahweh's singularity. By the time the Hebrew Bible reached its final form, monotheism had been established, and the traces of earlier rivals were largely erased. Yet if we look closely at the oldest layers of text, the memory endures. El Elyon, El Shaddai, Baal, and Asherah all left their imprint. Place names such as Bethel, personal names such as Samuel, heard by El, and early verses like Deuteronomy 32:8-9 remind us that Israel's God was not always alone. Over centuries of reform, conquest, exile, and redaction, the identities of El and Yahweh merged. Baal's powers were transferred, Asherah was silenced, and Yahweh was exalted as the one God.